At 6 feet 1 inch and 240 pounds, scouts laughed him out of draft day. But something happened that turned this undersized underdog into the NFL's most feared defensive player. With a chain hidden under his clothes and war paint on his face, he didn't just prove them wrong. He terrorized every quarterback in the league. From stalking opponents at grocery stores to psychological warfare on the field, his tactics were as unorthodox as they were legendary. 137 quarterbacks later, no one was laughing anymore. This is the story of John Randle, who went from undrafted to most feared defensive player. Texas high school football breeds legends, but nobody believed John Randle would be one of them. In a state where bigger meant better, Randle was the anomaly. A 6 foot 1 inch defensive player from a town of just 150 people. His high school didn't even have a weight room. Instead, he built strength by hauling hay bales and working construction during summers. When NFL scouts came calling, they weren't looking for Randle. They were there to see other players, bigger players, but Randle had something those scouts couldn't measure: an obsession with proving people wrong. During his college years at Texas A&I, he developed a unique playing style that emphasized quickness over power, technique over size. The 1990 NFL draft came and went without Randle's name being called. 28 teams, 12 rounds, 331 picks, and not one for John Randle. But the Minnesota Vikings saw something others missed. They offered him a tryout with one catch. He needed to weigh 250 pounds. That's when Randle's creativity first showed itself. The night before weigh-in, he and his roommate William Kai hatched a plan. They went to a hardware store and bought a heavy chain and padlock. Randle wrapped the chain around his waist, hiding it under his clothes. When he stepped on the scale, defensive coordinator Floyd Peters, cigarette dangling from his mouth, couldn't believe the number. 250 pounds exactly. Making the roster was just the first battle. Special teams became his proving ground. While other players saw it as punishment, Randle treated every special teams play like it was the Super Bowl. He'd sprint down the field with such ferocity that coaches couldn't ignore him. Even Deion Sanders, one of the most elusive returners in NFL history, struggled to find running lanes against Randle's coverage unit. The defensive coaching staff started noticing something else about Randle during practice. Despite his size disadvantage, he was consistently disrupting plays. His explosiveness off the line was unlike anything they'd seen. He didn't just move fast, he moved differently. While bigger players relied on power, Randle used angles and leverage that seemed to defy physics. During one memorable practice, he went up against Pro Bowl guard Randall McDaniel. McDaniel, like everyone else, expected to dominate the undersized rookie. Instead, Randle slipped past him 3 times in a row, using a combination of speed and technique that left McDaniel shaking his head. That practice session changed everything. The coaches realized they might have stumbled onto something special, but making the team was just the beginning. What Randle did next would revolutionize defensive line play and introduce psychological warfare to the NFL in ways no one had ever seen. The undersized underdog was about to become the league's most feared defensive player, and his methods would be anything but conventional. When Dennis Green became the Vikings head coach in 1992, he saw something in Randle that others missed. It wasn't just his speed or technique. It was his relentless motor. While other players tired in the fourth quarter, Randle seemed to get stronger. Green made a decision that would change NFL history. He moved Randle from defensive end to defensive tackle. The position switch confused many. Defensive tackles were supposed to be massive space eaters, not undersized speedsters. But Green's vision was revolutionary. He wanted to create mismatches, to put Randle's explosive first step against slower interior linemen. The results were immediate and devastating. In practice, Randle developed a signature move that would become legendary. He'd line up slightly offset, giving guards a false sense of security. Then at the snap, he'd explode across their face so quickly they couldn't recover. It was like trying to block a ghost. By the time they reacted, Randle was already in the backfield. Film study became his obsession. While other players hit the clubs after practice, Randle stayed late watching tape. He studied offensive linemen like a scientist, noting every tell, every weakness. He could predict when they would pass or run based on minute details, the way they leaned, how they positioned their feet, even how they breathed before the snap. The 1993 season marked his emergence. In a game against the Green Bay Packers, Randle recorded 3 sacks against an offensive line that had been dominating the league. The football world took notice. This wasn't just a fluke. This undersized defensive tackle was revolutionizing the position. His practice intensity became legendary. Coaches had to pull him out because he was disrupting the offensive game plan too much. Even in walkthroughs, Randle went full speed. His teammates called him the machine because he never seemed to tire. He'd often stay after practice, working on his moves against tackling dummies until the stadium lights came on. The sacks started piling up, but the way he got them was more impressive. Randle didn't overpower offensive linemen. He embarrassed them. He'd speed rush, spin move, swim move, all in the same play. Guards never knew what was coming, and by the time they figured it out, their quarterback was usually picking grass out of their face mask. But just when offensive linemen thought they had figured out how to handle Randle's physical skills, he unleashed a psychological weapon that would make him the most feared defender in the NFL. The face paint was coming, and with it, a brand of trash talk that would change the game forever. The face paint started as a joke. During a team movie night watching Young Guns, someone noticed how Randle's intense eyes resembled those of the film's wild-eyed cowboys. The next game, he showed up with eye black smeared across his face. 3 sacks later, a legend was born. But the face paint was just the beginning of Randle's psychological warfare. He developed a research system that would make FBI profilers proud. Before each game, he'd study not just game film, but personal details about his opponents. Their families, their hobbies, their fears. Everything was ammunition for his verbal artillery. The Steve Wisniewski incident became NFL legend. During a Raiders game, Wisniewski kept stepping on Randle's feet, a common tactic to throw defenders off balance. Instead of retaliating physically, Randle leaned in and whispered, "I know you shop at Randle's grocery store in Houston. Keep stepping on my feet and I'll be there waiting for you and your family." Wisniewski was so rattled, he false started twice in the next 3 plays. His trash talk wasn't random. It was calculated psychological warfare. He'd start subtle, maybe mentioning a player's hometown. Then he'd drop details about their personal life. By the 4th quarter, he'd be reciting their high school statistics. The more specific the details, the more it got in their heads. The face paint evolved too. It became more elaborate, more intimidating. He'd change the pattern based on his opponent. Against rookie linemen, he'd go full warrior mode. Against veterans, he'd paint subtle designs that he knew would catch their eye mid-play. Every aspect was designed to distract and disorient. During one memorable Monday Night Football game, he drove an all-pro guard so crazy with his talk that the player started arguing with his own quarterback. Randle just stood there, smiling through his face paint, and told his teammates, "Watch this. He's about to forget the snap count." Sure enough, false start. What made Randle's mind games so effective was his ability to back them up. He wasn't just talking, he was dominating. His combination of physical skill and psychological manipulation was unprecedented. Offensive coordinators started keeping their linemen away from him during pre-game warm-ups, afraid he'd get in their heads before the game even started. The mind games had made him feared, but what came next would make him immortal. As Randle entered his prime, he was about to put together a season that would rewrite the record books and change how defensive tackles played the game forever. The legend was about to become legendary. 1997 was John Randle's masterpiece. His preparation had reached a level of obsession that even his teammates couldn't comprehend. He'd arrive at the facility at 4 a.m., studying film before the janitors arrived. By game time, he knew his opponent's tendencies better than they did. His signature move that year became known as the Ghost. He'd line up slightly wide, then disappear from the guard's vision for a split second by ducking under their hands. By the time they realized what happened, their quarterback was already picking up his mouthpiece. The move was so effective, teams started keeping an extra blocker just to counter it. The numbers were staggering. 15 sacks from the defensive tackle position, a record that seemed impossible for an interior lineman. But it wasn't just sacks. He was disrupting entire offensive game plan. Teams started running plays away from him, only to find he'd already diagnosed their strategy and was waiting on the backside. His battle with Larry Allen of the Cowboys became the stuff of legend. Allen, arguably the strongest player in NFL history, was supposed to be Randle's kryptonite. Instead, Randle put on a clinic. He used Allen's strength against him, developing a move where he'd bait Allen into lunging, then spin off his momentum. 3 sacks later, Allen was asking for help from tight ends. During one stretch of games, Randle faced 5 consecutive All-Pro guards. The result? 8 sacks, 12 tackles for loss, and 3 forced fumbles. He wasn't just beating them, he was making them look like rookies. His first step had become so explosive that analysts started timing it with slow-motion cameras. The results were shocking. He was getting into the backfield faster than some quarterbacks could complete their drop back. His film study reached new levels. He could predict plays based on the smallest details, how a guard's back foot was angled, the way a center's fingers twitched before the snap. He'd call out plays before they happened, making his teammates wonder if he was psychic. By season's end, offensive coordinators were designing entire game plans around stopping him. Double teams became triple team. Quick passes became instant passes. Teams started using their best offensive linemen to chip him before releasing tight ends into routes. None of it mattered. Randle had an answer for everything. The dominance was complete, but Randle wasn't finished. As he prepared to enter the next phase of his career in Seattle, he was about to transform from a feared opponent into something even more impactful. A mentor who would shape the next generation of defensive linemen. The master was ready to create masters. When Randle signed with Seattle in 2001, the move raised eyebrows. Why would a dominant force join a rebuilding team? The answer became clear in his first practice. Randle wasn't just there to play. He was there to transform a culture. His impact was immediate, but not in the way many expected. Instead of just dominating offensive lines, he started teaching. Young defensive linemen would find detailed notes in their lockers, breaking down their technique from the previous practice. Randall had become a professor of defensive line play, and the Seahawks practice field was his classroom. He introduced his film study methods to the younger players, showing them how to spot tells that most veterans missed. But he didn't just teach technique, he taught mindset. The relentless motor, the psychological warfare, the preparation obsession, he passed it all on. His pre-practice routine became legendary. 2 hours before anyone else arrived, you'd find Randall working with rookie defensive linemen, teaching them moves he'd perfected over his career. The results were startling. Seattle's defensive line, previously a weakness, became one of the league's most feared units. Players who had been considered borderline talents were suddenly producing at high levels. They weren't just mimicking Randall's moves, they were adopting his entire approach to the game. But Randall wasn't done playing either. Even in his final seasons, he was still terrorizing quarterbacks. The difference now was that he'd explain to opponents after the game exactly how he'd beaten, turning even his dominance into teaching moments. Offensive linemen started seeking him out after games, asking for advice. The same players he'd tormented for quarters were now his students. His practice intensity never wavered. Even in his final season, coaches had to force him to take plays off. He'd be in full speed during walkthroughs, much to the annoyance of offensive coaches, but they couldn't argue with the results. His approach was infectious, raising the practice standard for the entire team. The culmination of his Seattle years wasn't measured in sacks or tackles. It was measured in the success of those he mentored. Players he'd worked with started getting Pro Bowl nods. Techniques he'd developed became standard teaching points across the league. His influence extended beyond just the Seahawks. He'd changed how the position was played and taught. From an undersized rookie who barely made the team to a Hall of Fame legend who revolutionized his position, Randall's journey had come full circle. But the numbers, records, and accolades only tell part of the story. It's in the faces of every undersized defensive lineman who made it because Randall proved it was possible. In every training camp where coaches teach his techniques, and in every game where his influence can still be seen. The legend of John Randle isn't just in what he did, it's in what he inspired others to become. John Randle turned too small into too tough to handle. A kid from small-town Texas became one of football's most feared defenders. Hit that subscribe button if you love underdog stories that prove anything is possible. Leave a comment. Who's your favorite defensive player of all time?